I spent the first 12 years of my life convinced that my family was sharing our Victorian home with something that didn't belong in the world of the living. What I discovered 30 years later about the true source of our haunting was more shocking than any ghost story, and it completely changed how I understand the difference between what we fear and what's actually dangerous. Hashtag the childhood haunting begins. The house at 247 Maple Street in Salem, Oregon, was built in 1894, and from the moment my family moved in when I was 5 years old, it felt like we were trespassing in someone else's space. The two-story Victorian had all the classic elements of a haunted house: creaky hardwood floors, ornate wallpaper that seemed to move in your peripheral vision, and windows that rattled even when there was no wind. But it wasn't the house's appearance that made me believe in ghosts. It was the sounds. Every night, starting around 11 p.m., I would hear footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Not the heavy footsteps of my parents or my older brother Jake, but lighter steps that seemed to pause outside my door for several seconds before continuing down the hall toward the staircase. The footsteps always followed the same pattern: 12 steps from the top of the stairs to my door, a pause, then 8 more steps to the end of the hallway. I counted them obsessively, lying in my small bed with my blankets pulled up to my chin, waiting for the nightly procession to begin. The footsteps were accompanied by what sounded like fabric rustling, as if someone in a long dress or robe was walking through our upstairs hallway every single night. When I first mentioned the footsteps to my parents, they dismissed them as house settling or the sound of our elderly cat, Whiskers, walking around upstairs. But Whiskers was declawed and barely made any sound when he walked, and these footsteps had a distinctly human rhythm and weight. The phenomena escalated beyond just sounds. Objects in the house would move when no one was looking. I'd place my homework on the kitchen table before dinner and find it neatly stacked on the counter afterward, even though no one in my family claimed to have touched it. My mother's reading glasses would disappear from her bedside table and reappear in the living room, always placed carefully on the coffee table as if someone had been borrowing them. The temperature changes were perhaps the most unsettling aspect of living in that house. There were specific spots throughout the house: the bottom 3 stairs, a corner of the living room near the old piano, and the hallway outside my bedroom door, that were always at least 10 degrees colder than the rest of the space. Even in summer, walking through these cold spots would give me goosebumps and make me shiver involuntarily. My family's reactions to these phenomena varied dramatically and created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that defined my childhood. My father, a practical engineer, refused to acknowledge anything unusual and would become irritated whenever anyone mentioned the strange occurrences. "Old houses make noises," he'd say dismissively. "Your imagination is running away with you." My mother was more open to the possibility that something unusual was happening, but she preferred to frame it in positive terms. "Maybe it's just the spirit of someone who loved this house," she'd say, trying to make the idea less frightening. "Maybe they're just making sure we're taking good care of their home." My brother Jake, who was 3 years older than me, was genuinely terrified by the house and spent as little time there as possible. He'd come home from school, do his homework quickly, and then find reasons to visit friends or stay after school for sports and activities. When he was home, he'd sleep with his bedroom door locked and his desk pushed against it. But I was different. While the phenomena frightened me, I was also fascinated by them. I started keeping a detailed journal of every unusual occurrence, noting the time, location, and specific details of what happened. By the time I was 10 years old, I had filled 3 composition notebooks with observations about our ghostly housemate. The activities seemed to intensify during certain times of the year, particularly in October and February. During these peak periods, the footsteps would occur multiple times per night, objects would move more frequently, and the cold spots would become so frigid that our breath would be visible even with the heat running. I also started noticing that the phenomena seemed to respond to our family's emotional state. During stressful periods, when my parents were arguing, when Jake was having problems at school, or when I was struggling with something, the activity would increase. It was as if our ghostly resident was feeding off our negative emotions or trying to comfort us during difficult times. The most consistent element was what I came to think of as the presence in my bedroom. Almost every night, I would feel like someone was standing near my bed, watching me sleep. I never saw anything when I opened my eyes, but the feeling was so strong and persistent that I would often sleep with my covers over my head, creating a small pocket of air that felt safer and more protected. Hashtag the unexplained escalates. As I grew older and became more observant, the phenomena in our house became increasingly difficult to rationalize or dismiss. What started as mysterious footsteps and moving objects evolved into events that seemed to defy basic laws of physics and challenge everything I thought I understood about reality. The most disturbing incidents involved items appearing in places where they had no logical reason to be. I would come home from school to find my homework assignments, which I'd left in my backpack in my bedroom, spread out neatly on the dining room table with corrections made in handwriting that didn't belong to anyone in my family. The corrections were always accurate and helpful, written in an old-fashioned script with a fountain pen that we didn't own.
Kitchen utensils would migrate between rooms overnight. I'd go to bed with the silverware properly sorted in the kitchen drawer and wake up to find forks and spoons arranged in neat patterns on the living room mantelpiece. My mother would discover her jewelry box items relocated to the bathroom counter, arranged in perfect symmetrical displays that took considerable time and care to create. The whispers began during my 6th grade year and were perhaps the most unsettling aspect of our haunting. Multiple family members would hear quiet conversations coming from empty rooms, always just quiet enough that we couldn't make out specific words, but clear enough that we knew someone was talking. The conversations seemed to happen most frequently in the living room and the upstairs hallway, always when those areas were unoccupied by living people. Jake and I would sometimes hear our names being called in our mother's voice when she wasn't home, or hear our father calling for help with projects when he was at work. These auditory hallucinations were so convincing that we'd often respond and search the house, only to find it completely empty. I became obsessed with finding rational explanations for what we were experiencing. I researched everything I could about old houses, infrastructure problems, and psychological phenomena that might account for our experiences. I learned about infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that can cause feelings of unease and can make people believe they're experiencing supernatural phenomena. I studied electromagnetic fields and how they might affect human perception and create illusions of movement or presence. I convinced my parents to have the house inspected for structural issues, pest problems, and electrical faults. We had HVAC technicians examine our heating and cooling systems to explain the temperature variations. We had electricians check for wiring problems that might cause unusual sounds or electromagnetic disturbances. Every professional who examined our house found minor issues typical of a century-old building, but nothing that could account for the specific phenomena we were experiencing. The footsteps, the moving objects, the whispers, and the cold spots remained unexplained. But the incident that finally broke my skeptical resolve happened on a February evening during my 7th grade year. I was alone in the house, working on a science project at the kitchen table, when I heard the familiar footsteps in the upstairs hallway. This wasn't unusual, but what happened next defied everything I thought I understood about reality. I decided to investigate instead of hiding in my room as I usually did. I quietly climbed the stairs, trying to time my movements with the footsteps I was hearing. When I reached the top of the stairs, the footsteps stopped, but I could see clear indentations in the carpet hallway runner, as if someone had just walked down the hall and the carpet fibers were still compressed from their weight. As I watched, the indentations moved slowly down the hallway toward my bedroom door, appearing one after another in a walking pattern. I could see each footprint form in the carpet and then slowly fade as the fibers returned to their normal position. But there was no one there. I was watching invisible feet create visible footprints in real time. I followed the footprints to my bedroom door, where they stopped. When I opened the door, I found every single item on my desk rearranged in alphabetical order. My books, my school supplies, even my homework assignments were sorted alphabetically by subject. This reorganization would have taken at least 15 minutes to complete, but I'd only been downstairs for 20 minutes total, and I would have heard anyone moving around in my room. That night, I finally accepted that our house was genuinely haunted by something that existed beyond my understanding of natural law. I stopped trying to find rational explanations and started treating our ghostly resident as a permanent member of our household. #, the skeptical investigation. 25 years later, I returned to Salem as a 37-year-old electrical engineer with a skeptical, analytical mindset and access to modern investigative tools that hadn't existed during my childhood. My parents had moved out of the Victorian house when I left for college, and it had changed hands several times since then. When I learned it was for sale again in 2021, I contacted the realtor and arranged a private walkthrough, ostensibly as a potential buyer, but actually as an investigator determined to solve the mystery of my childhood haunting. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but the layout was exactly the same. The hardwood floors still creaked in familiar patterns, the windows still rattled slightly, and walking through those rooms immediately brought back vivid memories of footsteps, whispers, and moving objects. But this time, I came prepared with equipment my child self couldn't have imagined. I brought electromagnetic field detectors, digital thermometers, sound recording equipment, and motion-activated cameras. I also carried a tablet loaded with historical records, property documents, and census data that I'd researched in preparation for this investigation. The first thing I did was map out the cold spots I remembered from childhood. Using a digital thermometer, I confirmed that specific areas of the house were indeed several degrees colder than surrounding spaces. The bottom 3 stairs registered at 64 degrees, while the living room was 71 degrees. The corner near the old piano was 62 degrees, and the spot outside my former bedroom door was a chilly 59 degrees. But instead of accepting these temperature variations as supernatural phenomena, I started looking for physical explanations. I examined the house's structure, checked for gaps in insulation, and looked for air circulation patterns that might create localized cold spots. The electromagnetic field detectors revealed unusual readings in several areas of the house, particularly near the locations where I'd experienced the most intense phenomena. But EMF anomalies in old houses are common and can be caused by outdated wiring, metal pipes, or electronic appliances. I spent 3 days in the house, sleeping in my old bedroom and documenting every sound, temperature change, and unusual occurrence. I recorded hours of audio and video, hoping to capture evidence of the footsteps and whispers that had defined my childhood experience. But the house was quiet. No footsteps, no moving objects, no whispers. The only sounds were normal settling noises and the hum of modern appliances. It was as if the ghostly resident had moved out years ago, leaving behind only the physical anomalies that had facilitated their presence. Frustrated by the lack of supernatural activity, I decided to focus on historical research. I spent weeks at the Marion County Historical Society, reviewing property records, census data, and newspaper archives related to 247 Maple Street and its previous owners. The house had been built in 1894 by Samuel Morrison, a local banker, for his wife Margaret and their 3 children. The Morrison family lived there for 12 years before Samuel's death in 1906. Margaret continued to live in the house until her own death in 1923, after which it was sold to the Henderson family. But the most interesting discovery came from death records and obituaries. Margaret Morrison had died in the house in February 1923, at the age of 67, from complications related to pneumonia. According to the obituary, she had been bedridden for several weeks before her death, and her bedroom was located at the end of the upstairs hallway, exactly where my childhood footsteps had always stopped. I also found records indicating that Margaret Morrison had been known in the community for her charitable work and her habit of tutoring local children in reading and arithmetic. Several people mentioned in interviews and letters that Margaret had beautiful penmanship and was meticulous about organization and proper grammar. This historical information provided potential context for some of the phenomena I'd experienced: the corrected homework, the organized objects, and the sense of a caring presence watching over the household. But it still didn't explain the physical aspects of the haunting or why the activity had seemed to respond to our family's emotional state. The breakthrough came when I decided to interview previous residents of the house and neighbors who had lived on Maple Street for decades. I placed ads in local newspapers and on community bulletin boards, asking anyone with information about 247 Maple Street to contact me for a research project. Hashtag the truth emerges. Mrs. Dorothy Chin, who had lived across the street from our house for 40 years, provided the crucial piece of information that finally solved the mystery of my childhood haunting. When I interviewed her in her living room, surrounded by photo albums and neighborhood memorabilia, she shared a story that no one had ever mentioned to my family. "Oh, that house," she said when I explained my research. "Your parents never knew about the tunnel, did they?" My heart started racing. "What tunnel?" Mrs. Chin explained that during the 1960s, the teenage son of the house's previous owners had excavated an elaborate tunnel system connecting the basement of 247 Maple Street to a storm drain that emptied into Mill Creek, about 2 blocks away. The tunnel had been the boy's secret project, worked on for over 2 years without his parents' knowledge. Tommy Henderson was obsessed with caves and underground exploration, Mrs. Chin recalled. He spent every free moment digging that tunnel, hauling out buckets of dirt through the basement window when his parents weren't home. The neighborhood kids all knew about it, but we were sworn to secrecy. The tunnel had been forgotten after Tommy left for college in 1967, and subsequent owners of the house had no knowledge of its existence. Over the decades, the tunnel had become a habitat for various animals and had developed its own ecosystem of air currents and temperature variations. But Mrs. Chen's most shocking revelation was that the tunnel hadn't been abandoned. Local teenagers have been using that tunnel for years, she said. It's become this urban legend, this secret passage that kids use to move around the neighborhood without being seen. Your family lived there for 7 years, and I bet you never knew kids were coming and going through your basement. The implications were staggering. Everything I had interpreted as supernatural phenomena could be explained by the presence of teenagers secretly accessing our house through an underground tunnel. The footsteps I'd heard weren't ghostly. They were real people walking through our upstairs hallway late at night. The moved objects, the corrected homework, the organized items, all of it could have been the work of local kids who had unrestricted access to our home. I immediately arranged to examine the basement of 247 Maple Street, and sure enough, behind a false wall panel that looked like it had been installed during a 1970s renovation, I found the entrance to Tommy Henderson's tunnel. The opening was about 3 feet square, just large enough for a teenager to crawl through comfortably. The tunnel itself was more sophisticated than I'd expected. Tommy had reinforced the walls with wooden planks, installed basic ventilation, and even run an electrical wire to power a few light bulbs along the route. Over the years, subsequent users had maintained and improved the tunnel, adding weatherproofing and better lighting. Most importantly, the tunnel's ventilation system explained all the physical anomalies I'd documented during my childhood. The cold spots in the house were directly above points where the tunnel's airflow created updrafts through gaps in the floorboards. The electromagnetic anomalies were caused by the electrical wire Tommy had installed, which had never been properly grounded and created interference with the house's main electrical system. But the emotional component of the haunting, the sense that the phenomena responded to our family's stress levels, had a more complex explanation. Mrs. Chin revealed that the neighborhood teenagers who used the tunnel weren't just passing through randomly. They were specifically watching our family and timing their visits based on our routines and emotional states. Those kids felt sorry for your family, Mrs. Chin explained. They could see that your parents were struggling, that your brother was unhappy, that you seemed lonely and scared. They started leaving little gifts and helpful gestures. Some of them were honor students who would correct homework or organize things. It was their way of trying to help without revealing themselves. The whispers and voices I'd heard were real conversations between teenagers who were using our house as a meeting place and hangout spot. They would gather in our living room late at night, talking quietly while they assumed we were all asleep upstairs. When they heard us moving around, they would call out things like Jake or help to make us think we were hearing family members, hoping to confuse us and avoid detection. Beyond the ghost story, the revelation that my childhood haunting had been caused by a secret tunnel and a group of well-meaning teenage trespassers was simultaneously disappointing and enlightening. I had spent decades believing I'd experienced something supernatural, something that connected me to mysteries beyond the physical world. Learning that everything had a mundane explanation felt like losing a part of my personal mythology. But the psychological impact of understanding the truth was ultimately more powerful than the ghost story had ever been. I realized that my childhood experiences had been genuine. I had heard real footsteps, witnessed real objects being moved, and sensed the presence of real people in my house. My perceptions hadn't been wrong, only my interpretation of what was causing those perceptions had been incorrect. The experience taught me important lessons about the difference between skepticism and cynicism. Being skeptical means demanding evidence and logical explanations, but it doesn't mean dismissing experiences that seem unusual or unexplained. My childhood phenomena were real and documented. I just needed better information to understand their true cause. I also learned about the power of community and the unexpected ways people show care for each other. The teenagers who had been secretly accessing our house weren't malicious intruders. They were compassionate young people who had noticed our family's struggles and found a creative way to offer help without embarrassing us or revealing their presence. The corrected homework, the organized objects, the sense of a caring presence watching over us, all of these things had been genuine expressions of concern and support from members of our community who had chosen to remain anonymous. In some ways, this truth was more beautiful and meaningful than any ghost story could have been. Most importantly, the experience changed how I approach unexplained phenomena in my adult life. Instead of immediately dismissing unusual experiences as impossible or immediately accepting them as supernatural, I've learned to investigate thoroughly while remaining open to unexpected explanations. I've also developed a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human perception and the ways our minds construct narratives from incomplete information. My brain had taken real sensory data, sounds, temperature changes, visual evidence of moved objects, and created a coherent explanation based on the cultural context and information available to me as a child. The story of my haunted house ultimately became a story about hidden connections, community care, and the importance of looking beyond surface explanations to understand the deeper truths about our experiences. The teenagers who used Tommy Henderson's tunnel to secretly help my family taught me that sometimes the most extraordinary human kindness happens in the shadows, without recognition or acknowledgement. Today, when I encounter stories about unexplained phenomena or supernatural experiences, I listen with both skepticism and openness. I know that unusual experiences often have unusual explanations, but those explanations might be more wonderful and complex than any ghost story could ever be. The house at 247 Maple Street is still standing, still creaking, and probably still harboring secrets that its current residents haven't discovered yet. But now I know that the most important mysteries aren't about what lies beyond the physical world. They're about the hidden connections and unexpected kindnesses that exist right here in the world we share with each other. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain that shaped your childhood or worldview? What would you do if you discovered that a supernatural experience from your past had a completely ordinary explanation? And how do we balance healthy skepticism with openness to extraordinary experiences? ***.